In this week's episode of Bleach the Thousand Year Blood War arc, Kenpachi releases his Bankai against Gerard, Hitsugaya reveals his completed Bankai, and Ichigo wields the power of a hollow against Yuhabak. Wow? Episode 44 of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, titled The Perfect Crimson, might just be the single craziest episode of the series to date. And we kind of knew it would be, right? I mean, at least based on what came before in the manga. For if they were planning on covering the entirety of the showdown with Gerard Valkyrie in one go, then this was always going to be a veritable volley of fan service, insane power-ups, and incredible clashes. And that's pretty much exactly what we got, with some neat additions sprinkled in as well for good measure. As a result, this is a roller coaster ride of an episode, one which moves at breakneck speed, and one that, of particular interest to me, leaves us in a very tantalizing place regarding the following 6 episodes still to come. There isn't quite as much new content this week as we are cramming in a lot already, and actually, the episode ventures much further into the manga than I thought it would. But there's plenty to look at, and I'm very excited to dive in. Of course, this was also the first episode that was completely brand new to everyone. We're finally free of the Theatre 3, and it feels fantastic. And so as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the Thousand Year Blood War arc episode 44, The Perfect Crimson, as always I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. Remember, one of the best places to support the channel is over on Patreon, just like all of these people are doing. It's gratefully appreciated, and it really does help out enormously, so thank you all so very much. Let's begin this review then, and as always we'll start by taking a look at what chapters are covered in this week's episode. And this time, I almost called this one in its entirety. Last week I predicted that the anime would try to cover the Gerard fight in full here, so that they are unencumbered when moving into the next episode and beyond, and that's exactly what's happened. To that end, we covered a lot of chapters. Now this is still nowhere near as completely overstuffed as, say, episode 20, Kenpachi vs. Gremmy, and remember, as I said last time, there are multiple action-oriented chapters here, big action set pieces that in the manga featured enormous paneling, very little dialogue, and ultimately without filler, result in barely a couple of minutes of coverage apiece here in the anime. And so without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 44. First we have chapter 668, Bigger, Faster, Stronger, chapter 669, Blade 2, chapter 670, The Perfect Crimson, the episode's title, chapter 671, The Perfect Crimson 2, chapter 672, Son of Darkness, chapter 673, Father, chapter 674, Father 2, and finally chapter 676, Horn of Salvation. Honestly, I kind of thought the next episode would be called Horn of Salvation, but it isn't, and we'll get to that a bit later. But yeah, this is a chunky episode. Unlike the last couple of episodes where it seemed like there are a lot of chapters being covered on the surface, but in reality it's mostly all broken up. No, this time there's just a lot of chapters being covered in general. Chapters 668, 669, 670, 671, and 676 are all essentially covered in full here, from start to finish. On top of this, this episode also briefly revisits moments from chapters 667 and 675 from the previous episode too, so yeah, there's a lot going on. But this is also a strangely satisfying episode to cover in this regard too. In some ways, this feels like a chronological cleanup. The anime has finally gotten to the chapters that have been left behind in the mass restructuring, and as a result, by the end of this episode, there technically aren't any chapters left outstanding that we still need to go back to. Instead, the only chapters that are now completely untouched are those that lie directly ahead from chapter 677 onwards, the final 10. That being said, there are a scant few scenes still to cover from some of these other chapters, specifically everything between Uryu and Hashwolf that is yet to be introduced from the manga, but that we now know will be, thanks to the last trailer. But aside from that, the anime is now totally caught up to where it needs to be, And that's exciting, because it gives us an easy and straightforward look at how much content there is left to be adapted. With only 10 chapters remaining, let's call it 11-ish, if we include the Uryu vs Hashwolf stuff too, and 6 full episodes still to come, yeah, things are about to get kind of wild. There's now no escaping the fact that there is gonna be a lot of new content, to put it lightly, in the episodes to come. Each remaining episode could cover only 2 chapters apiece, and there would still be roughly room for 50 to 60% new content left over in each of them. Considering I've been saying all this time that 4 chapters has been the sweet spot with the Thousand Year Blood War arc anime's fairly quick pacing so far, this is going to present a pretty massive change. Anyway, let's move on to the spoiler analysis itself as we take a deeper look at episode 44 of the Thousand Year Blood War arc titled The Perfect Crimson. Before we do that, another fantastic way to support the channel and to support weekly Bleach content like this is simply by hitting subscribe down below if you enjoyed the content, that is. It helps the channel enormously, it gets us more exposure on the whole YouTube algorithm, and we're trying to reach 300,000 subs as well, which is only going to be possible with your help, so please consider doing so today. So the episode begins with a totally new sequence, as Akon and the other 12th Division members, left behind to monitor the situation, are suddenly horrified as the earthquakes start up again, causing the alerts to begin blaring. Hyosu reveals the border intensity reading spiked suddenly, as Akon suggests the reason for this is that Ukitake's power must be weakening. So, yes, this is our first real look at Ukitake since episode 40, when we saw Mimihagi's seal seemingly reaffixing itself behind the captain's body, and yes, despite the seal now clearly being back in place for whatever reason, Ukitake is still alive long after he is taken out of the manga story, and is managing to hold on. Back in episode 39, we saw Yhwach managing to break Mimihagi's anchoring hold on the 3 worlds, but despite that, somehow it seems Ukitake and the right arm are still managing to put up a fight, albeit a losing one. This really does make me wonder how Ukitake's story will come to an end here in the anime. Even having him involved like this for essentially the entirety of the Varvelt arc is so much better than how things played out for him in the manga, as here it feels as though the Shinigami's assault on Varvelt is literally only possible in the first place thanks to Ukitake's prolonged actions. Whereas in the manga, it was very easy to say that everything Ukitake did, his sacrifice, it was all in vain, when everything he did was completely undone about 5 chapters later. But I'm kind of assuming that something will happen that will force Mimihagi out of Ukitake's body in the end, which is what ultimately happens in the manga. Only that was about 60 chapters ago at this point. But in a really cool and ominous sequence, Akon declares the 3 worlds will cease to exist, while a crow in the world of the living looks on as the Sternritter itself appears in the sky above. Now this is a far cry from where we left the world of the living last time back in episode 41, as we saw rifts were appearing in the sky, but now the entire Sternritter is very clearly visible looming overhead. And I guess this explains why the R&D guys appeared in the new opening. Moving on, we briefly revisit the ending of the previous episode as Gerard explains his ability of the miracle after injuring Kenpachi Bankai and Hitsugaya with Hofnung's special power. And so we find ourselves back in chapter 668 as Kenpachi berates Gerard for telling him the secret to defeating him, while Gerard berates the captain back for not understanding that he was just trying to bridge the gap in their power by telling him as such. Meanwhile, Hitsugaya can't help but think the two of them are somewhat alike. In a nice bit of choreography taken straight from the manga, Gerard attempts to stab Kenpachi by driving his blade into the ground. Kenpachi charges him, however, darting up the side of the sword, which is always a really cool visual, again a great use of scale, before springing from Gerard's hand and then taking aim at the giant's face with a swing of Nozarashi. Gerard dodges at the last second and then swipes at Kenpachi with his free hand, smacking the captain into a nearby building. It is well done, even if it lasts maybe 30 seconds tops. But as Kenpachi and Gerard complement each other, Hitsugaya comes soaring in, flying around the giant's back, before attempting to unleash Guncho Sorara, an ability we haven't seen since his battle against Harabel. Like I mentioned in my live reaction again, I like the sense of scale that this fight manages to achieve. The imagery of Hitsugaya swooping round in a wide arc, yet all you can see, kind of in the foreground, are the ripples of Gerard's cape. It's pretty effective, it looks really cool. But as Gerard snaps at Hitsugaya for interfering in the fight, Kenpachi comes out of nowhere and strikes his fellow captain, sending Hitsugaya careening downwards and smashing into the ground. As Hitsugaya demands to know what Kenpachi is doing, the 11th Division captain roars at both Hitsugaya and Byakuya to get out of here and leave the fight to him. I always really liked this dynamic, and I wish a little more had been done with it. Actually getting a good first-hand look at how Kenpachi approaches a situation like this. Because even though he does attack Hitsugaya here, he clearly doesn't put any real strength behind it. One of the many instances, in my opinion, that go some way to proving that Kenpachi is much more than just a mad dog. Of course, it does make me laugh that Kenpachi actually interrupted Hitsugaya and Byakuya's fight in the first place, but there you go. But as Byakuya tells Hitsugaya to let it go, as Kenpachi can't be reasoned with, we then get a great measure of Hitsugaya's true character. I've always said that Hitsugaya is perhaps the most purely good of all the captains, and that really shines through here. Even though Kenpachi is belligerent, Hitsugaya doesn't want to leave him behind, especially since Gerard is clearly an enemy that Kenpachi cannot defeat on his own. He would rather stay and fight alongside him, potentially drawing Kenpachi's ire, but he'd rather do that than leave a fellow captain to almost certain death. And true enough, not only has Kenpachi already released his Shikai, but he's also taken off his eye patch too. So as far as they're concerned, he's got nowhere else to go. However, Byakuya can't help but notice that a few of Hitsugaya's ice petals have already fallen, and he surmises that they're all exhausted and they're all short on time. Hitsugaya asks for Byakuya's help. He's going to freeze Gerard to the bone, after which he then needs Byakuya to pulverize him using Senbon Zakura. What's cool about this is that it's a nice piece of foreshadowing, as although their plan ultimately falls short here, in the end, this is how they destroy Gerard's body later on. Meanwhile, Kenpachi continues to take the fight to Gerard, the two of them locking blades ferociously, clashing over and over in a flurry of sparks. But with almost every clash, a piece of Kenpachi is gouged out by Hoffnung's ability, causing the captain's strength to wane. I can't help but think that even Kenpachi might have stopped to try and figure out a different approach by now. Constantly attacking Gerard's sword, constantly injuring yourself, and getting nowhere seems like a pretty bad idea that I think even Kenpachi would have identified. Now, initially, I didn't think this shot of Gerard practically impaling Kenpachi on the end of Hoffnung came from the manga, but it kind of does. It's just tiny, and it looks like Kenpachi is being buffeted by some general attack. The anime version feels a lot more brutal. But as we reach the end of chapter 668, Byakuya tries to engulf Gerard from above with his Bankai, but the giant breaks free. He then brings his sword down upon Hitsugaya, all while declaring that he sees all, for he is the biggest, strongest, fastest Quincy, the one who was bestowed with everything. This is honestly a pretty cool line, and just goes to show how far above basically every other sternritter Gerard truly is. Now, I still think that Lige could kill him by destroying his core with the X-axis, but aside from that, Gerard is clearly supposed to be the single most capable and well-rounded warrior among them all. But then, we see Kenpachi lying in a huge pool of blood. As he appears completely defeated and near death, he suddenly hears a voice. Yachiru has returned. His vice captain, who has been missing in the anime since episode 21, is sitting perched on a fallen log beside him, and... wait a minute. That fallen log wasn't in the manga. Yes, while Yachiru effectively just materializes beside Kenpachi on the Varvelt battlefield in the source material, here in the anime, Kenpachi appears to wake up transported somewhere completely different, yet totally familiar. Yachiru appears to Kenpachi in the same forest clearing the two of them once met, and the anime uses the same flashback style that it used not just for Unohana's first meeting with Kenpachi, that kind of sepia tone, but also when the anime recreated Kenpachi and Yachiru's first meeting during the reveal of his Shikai, which consequently was the last time we saw her in physical form in the anime. So, what does this mean? It's totally possible it doesn't mean anything at all, and it's just meant to be a nice callback to a place that's important to the two of them, as their relationship kind of comes full circle and Yachiru's purpose in the story is revealed. But considering Yachiru's true nature as the spirit of Kenpachi's Bankai, it would be cool if this was actually Kenpachi's inner world, which took on this form after the two of them met all those years ago. Considering the blade is me, considering Yachiru is Kenpachi, and that forest clearing in the Rukongai district of Kusajishi means a lot to her, it's where Kenpachi rescued her from a blood-soaked world, it makes sense that his inner world would also be somewhere that meant a lot to her. So yeah, this is a really awesome little detail in my opinion, and it kind of helps to tie Kenpachi's entire subplot here in the anime together. But as Yachiru tells Kenpachi that if he uses her properly, there's no one he can't cut, she bestows an incredible power upon him, one that flows into him, illuminating his hand before his eyes. With the shape of Nozarashi reflected in her eyes, Yachiru reveals this power to be none other than Bankai. And again, in another really awesome new moment, when she says Bankai, she isn't the only one saying it. Unohana's voice can clearly be heard layered over the top as well. Well, presumably it's meant to be Nozarashi, but you get the idea. But as we begin chapter 669, Kenpachi is consumed by a gigantic pillar of yellow energy on a completely incredible scale. As both Byakuya and Hitsugaya watch from afar, interestingly Byakuya is now holding his sealed Zanpakuto despite using Bankai mere moments ago. We then see Rangiku and Hanataro also observing the column of power, and this single shot tells us exactly what Rangiku has been up to since leaving Mayuri's restoration pod. Hanataro can be seen carrying someone, and although not easy to identify, this character is none other than Kiyone Kotetsu, as evident by her distinctive glove. So, rather than get actively involved in the battle, Matsumoto and Hanataro are now clearly collecting the fallen vice captains who were sniped by Liege back in episode 33, and are presumably now working to save their lives. If you ask me, it's nice for Matsumoto to actually be given something to do, even if people expected her to contribute to Gerard's ultimate defeat, and maybe she still will, though I'm personally not holding my breath. We also see that Ikkaku and Yumichika are indeed watching the fight after all. I did kind of call that as well. So that moment from the start of chapter 667 showing them arriving after their captain was indeed cut. But we then get our first look at Kenpachi's unnamed Bankai. Illuminated by the fiery glow of bubbling magma beneath his feet, a new detail added in the anime showing the earth literally cracking and splitting apart under the captain, Kenpachi emerges from the fiery dust, hunched over like a beast, his head down, facing the ground. His skin is now a blood red, though weirdly the anime version of this shot, the reveal shot, doesn't actually pan far enough out to show you that his Zanpakuto has been smashed in half. Which is a little weird to me, as that kind of feels like a major component of the Bankai design. And this won't be the last time this episode kind of screws up one of these transformation reveal shots, but we'll get there in a bit. While I think I do ultimately prefer the manga version of this particular shot, I'm very happy to see it here, and it's extremely cool in general to finally see this brought to life in the anime. In the manga, it is Ikkaku and Yumichika who notice Kenpachi's red skin, but here in the anime it's Byakuya and Hitsugaya. But as Gerard smugly notes that he thought the surge in Kenpachi's spiritual pressure meant that he'd released his Bankai, the Quincy is disappointed to see apparently very little has changed. Inexplicably, putting Hoffnung to the side, Gerard claims it would be a waste to swing Hoffnung at Kenpachi while he's wielding only a broken blade. Which is not only hilarious, but it also doesn't really make any sense. I mean, I kind of get it, Gerard wants a worthy opponent, he wants a worthy fight, but of course the true reason is that if Gerard did swing Hoffnung, and Kenpachi in his Bankai state simply broke the blade in half, or shattered it, or punched a hole through it, or something like that, well, that would basically be game over for Kenpachi's Bankai as soon as it arrived. So Kubo had to do something. But as Gerard moves to punch Kenpachi, and we get a cool shot of Gerard's fist as we follow it down towards Kenpachi far below, Kenpachi suddenly looks up, a crazed, demonic expression now etched onto the man's face, his mouth curled upwards in a cruel, toothy grin. Considering how genuinely amazing the shot of Kenpachi's face looks in the manga, the amount of insane detailing going on in the line art there, this moment was always going to be a tall order to replicate. While I think they did a really great job, I wish they lingered on it for just a bit longer. And that's something I kind of noticed. You don't really get a great look at Kenpachi's Bankai here in the anime. A look that allows you to soak in those details. And again, I get it, because everything is moving at a completely breakneck speed to try and capture the physicality, the essence of this Bankai in action. But still, I think a moment this massive would have warranted it. And it doesn't help as well that Kenpachi's Bankai has this continuous steam-like Reiatsu effect leaking from him at all times. So again, as you'll see in some of these screenshots, his face and body is oftentimes slightly out of focus. But again, really, I'm only nitpicking because this is such a major moment that people have been waiting years to see. The truth is that it really does look very cool. The red is a great colour that pops on the screen, especially against the black background of the Varvelt sky, and also the art in general is just fantastic. It's on a completely different level to last week's. Opening his mouth wide, Kenpachi clamps down on Gerard's fist with his teeth, and with an animalistic snarl, he tears Gerard's arm off with a single twist of his jaw. Gerard screams as his entire limb is ripped away, and Kenpachi spits it across the cityscape. As Gerard reforms his arm and attempts to crush the captain with it, Kenpachi leaps upwards and carves right through the sternritter's shield with a single swing of his blade, slicing off Gerard's hand and cutting into his forehead as well, blood spraying everywhere. I do love that they captured the sense of real force when Kenpachi swings his blade in this form. But as Gerard kind of stumbles backwards, Kenpachi then propels himself, rockets towards his enemy, and slams into his chin, driving the giant through the streets of Varvelt before pushing him off the edge of the city itself. Although Gerard attempts to slow himself down by driving Hoffnung into the ground, it doesn't matter. Kenpachi sends him flying from the side without a care in the world. I like that the anime kept the detail that Gerard's arm doesn't finish reforming before Kenpachi ultimately defeats him. It's a clever way to show you just how insanely fast the captain is moving and attacking. But as Gerard falls, he suddenly sprouts an enormous pair of crimson wings, allowing him to fly back up again. And as he does, he begins bellowing that the Shinigami pushing him to the brink is an absurdity that cannot be allowed to happen. Exactly the kind of villain talk that Askin was bemoaning a couple of episodes ago, before readying his blade, a red light beginning to coalesce around it. I always thought Gerard looked really cool here, to be honest, specifically like a holy angel in the way he was flying and wielding his weapon, so again it's great to see the anime kept it as such. But as we reach the end of chapter 669, Kenpachi jumps towards Gerard, while the sternritter thrusts his blade forward, the two of them meeting in midair. And with a single swing of his sword, Kenpachi splits the enormous angel in two right down the middle, sending the separate halves of Gerard crashing into the ground below. Again, for as awesome as this looks, I would have loved it if the anime included even a brief shot of the close-up on Kenpachi's face from the final page of this chapter, because again, it just doesn't feel like we get enough great, clear looks at this form. But alas, the actual shot of Kenpachi bifurcating Gerard looks really amazing though. Now before we start chapter 670, we have a couple of new moments to look at, as those observing the fight from afar revel in what just happened. Ikaku and Yumichika look on in amazement at their captain's power, while Hinamori also watches the fight unfold, and surprisingly, Shinji is behind her, resting against some debris. As Hinamori asks to be allowed to assist him, Shinji instead orders her to heal Rukia and Renji first. So this is pretty cool. Again, a bit like Ukitake, Shinji is taken out of the manga so much earlier than this, and after doing literally nothing as well. In fact, it would have been way back in episode 39 where we would have seen the last of Shinji based on the manga, so to see that he's still kicking about despite being smacked around by Gerard, that's fantastic. Although he is looking a little sorry for himself, I really wouldn't be surprised at this point if he's back on his feet again later on, ready to continue the battle, maybe in a new extended ending of the Gerard fight. But as Byakuya prevents Hitsugaya from getting too close to Kenpachi, Kenpachi suddenly leaps backwards into the air, putting some distance between himself and Gerard's corpse. As the captain roars, it is unclear as to why he's so riled up, until we suddenly see a giant Quincy cross glitter in the darkness. As a really fantastic new soundtrack begins to play, an unexpected one that is weirdly ethereal and mystical, the Quincy cross floats ominously up into the air, a ring of Gerard's blood encircling it. In fact, the Quincy cross is lifting up the two halves of Gerard's corpse by his blood. And interestingly, despite being split in two, here in the anime, Gerard's weird eyes are still glowing, as is his reformed arm and his red wings. And I never noticed this until now, but in the manga, Gerard's reformed arm is replaced by, well, his old arm, which I think must be an art error because, based on how the miracle works, when Gerard's arm reformed completely, if it had managed to do so before he was killed, it should have again looked completely different. However, as Gerard is revived, the anime adds a very interesting and very welcome new wrinkle to the proceedings. Gerard's blood is pulled towards the Quincy cross before wrapping around it and forming a beating heart. The heart is then the focus of the transformation, as it is sealed back inside Gerard's body as a brilliant gold light quite literally stitches Gerard back together again. This is obviously pretty big for a few reasons. I've been a long-time proponent of wanting to learn more about Gerard, what he really is, and what the Quincy cross at his core is all about. How it relates to the Soul King's heart, if at all. And, well, the anime has at the very least proven that yes, it does seem to be totally related. In fact, the Quincy cross may actually be the Soul King's heart itself. And unless it's destroyed, the heart will continue to beat, and it will continue to resurrect Gerard, who at this point is clearly some kind of golem-like retainer designed to keep the heart safe at all times. But I do wonder what the ramifications of this reveal are. Since the heart formed around the Quincy cross, does that mean the cross itself is the heart, and it just takes on a kind of heart-like appearance for its exterior? Because clearly, at least in my opinion, in the anime, when Kenpachi cuts Gerard in half, I would assume that exterior heart-shaped shell was destroyed by Kenpachi's strike, but not the cross itself. And so the cross just built itself a new heart exterior of sorts. I really don't know, but them drawing attention to it like this and linking it back to the Soul King's heart gives me a lot of optimism that we may actually learn more before the end, and hopefully it will come into play in Gerard's ultimate defeat. The only thing giving me pause about all of this is that Gerard's entire body is destroyed later in the episode, just as it was in the manga. It's completely reduced to dust, and yet there is no mention of the heart at that time in the anime, which is weird. But of course, this isn't the first time the anime has made a bigger deal out of the fact that Gerard is supposedly housing the Soul King's heart. Way before the anime even mentions that, we see the heart. We see that Gerard's heart is able to protect itself from Senjumaru's Shigarami back in episode 26. But as Gerard's body, now garbed in gold light, hovers above the battlefield, everyone watches in disbelief as he returns to life. Interestingly again, we can see that the final stage of the transformation originates from the centre of his body as a red light shoots outwards, shattering the gold shell. And of course, Gerard reappears, now in his Quincy Volston dish, and lands with an enormous crash upon the ground. And this is the other transformation reveal shot that I don't think the anime quite does justice to. It's weird that they only show his lower half here. The manga reveals Gerard's new appearance in an amazing double-page spread that looks genuinely majestic and titanic and really, really cool. And so I thought the anime might show Gerard landing as it does in the episode, and then pan upwards to reveal the rest of him. But no, they just show you his crotch, basically, which is an odd decision in my opinion, especially when the manga version with the cityscape below really captures the new scale of the holy form. Here it just looks... it doesn't look quite right because for some reason they don't show you the rest of him. But speaking of Gerard's Volstendish, unless Ryuken or Yuhabak bust out a surprise holy form in the episodes to come, Ashtonig is our final new Quincy Volstendish of the series. The last of the church bells has potentially rung. However, this next segment might be the coolest moment of this entire episode, and that is saying something. Remember, once Gerard releases his Volstendish in the manga, Kenpachi's Bankai is basically immediately taken out of the fight. But that doesn't quite happen here. Instead, Kenpachi gets one more really incredible moment. As he blasts out of the dust and heads straight for Gerard, the sternritter points the tip of his sword at Kenpachi and charges a brilliant red light before unleashing a powerful arrow shot, bathing the battlefield in crimson. Now this happens in the manga as well, but one element is different. Kenpachi isn't involved here at all in the manga. But here in the anime, Kenpachi meets this arrow head-on, blocking the blast with his blade, and drives it back towards Gerard, eventually redirecting the energy beam across Varvelt, destroying a huge swath of the cityscape and even severing one of the branches of the city entirely. It looks absolutely amazing, to be honest with you, and it is a great new sequence for Kenpachi's Bankai to really go out on. As Gerard's attack destroys a piece of Varvelt, we see Kyoraku and Nanao where we last left them. And I'd kind of forgotten this, but of course they are obviously meant to be on the same part of Varvelt that the rest of this fight is taking place on. So now they're suddenly in danger. But this is quickly followed by Rukia and Renji's unconscious bodies tumbling from the side as well, which is pretty crazy. But luckily everyone is rescued by Hitsugaya's quick thinking, as he expends an enormous amount of ice to keep the arm of the city afloat. However, as he does, Gerard, again looking really fantastic, really imposing here, and the music again as well is very strange, but again it's really quite epic and it fits really well, I think. Gerard swings his blade at the captain, unleashing a massive explosion of energy, following the blade in a kind of glowing trail, which sends the icy captain flying. Now, I'll be honest, I was quite surprised by this. I never thought that Gerard was actually releasing an energy blast in this panel in the manga. I thought that was just supposed to be the dust trail left behind from him demolishing all of those buildings with his sword. But again, the music is fantastic and Gerard really does look quite epic in this form. Here, sandwiched in between Kenpachi's Bankai and what comes next, he really does feel truly unstoppable, and I'm so glad he isn't CGI as well. But Gerard, now wearing a huge helmet, the design of which is pretty cool, the bottom part looks like it's meant to resemble a beard, announces himself as Ashtonig, the noble warrior of God, and the one who will continue to swing his sword for God, even in death. As he brings his blade down upon Kenpachi in the manga, this is where Kenpachi's arm is destroyed, completely removing any chance of a clash between them. Here, however, Kenpachi dodges the blade and runs up Gerard's arm, leaping at the giant and slashing at his neck. But interestingly, Gerard is able to completely and effortlessly block Bankai Kenpachi's strike thanks to Blute Vein, before the giant then tries to grab Kenpachi from behind. Kenpachi dodges him again, however, and moves to attack Gerard's head this time, but this is where the manga kicks in, and Kenpachi's arm ruptures in an explosion of blood. Considering we then see Yachiru again, and the visual is the same as it was when she approached Kenpachi earlier, it seems fairly obvious that this is indeed meant to be his inner world, especially since said world clearly moves with him. Now that he is in the air on the outside, he's in the sky in his inner world as well, having left the forest behind. But Yachiru apologizes, revealing she released too much of Kenpachi's power at once, and his body just isn't ready to handle it. This causes Kenpachi to plummet to the ground, as Gerard then slashes at him with his gigantic blade. Hitsugaya calls out to Kenpachi, which in turn causes Gerard to turn his attention to the little captain instead. Gerard smacks Hitsugaya into the air, but Byakuya rescues his ally, catching him on a wave of petals and dropping him safely to the ground. It does make me laugh how incredibly chill Byakuya just seems to be for the majority of this fight, and I was hoping that he might get a little more involved here in the anime than he did in the manga. But no, actually, everything, Byakuya included, has been almost completely faithful to the manga, which itself is a bit of a surprise. However, as Hitsugaya appears to be completely exhausted and the last of his ice petals falls, Byakuya warns him to disengage his Bankai. And yet, as a cloud of ice washes over Hitsugaya, the final petal shattering like glass, the captain notes that he never once said the last of the petals meant that it was over. And with that, he emerges from the frozen mist, transformed. Complete with a new, deeper voice, Hitsugaya has grown into an adult, ice covering his limbs and shoulders like armor. Rising to his feet, Hitsugaya explains that his own power isn't developed enough yet to have full command over Hyorinmaru, and as such he becomes older when his Bankai is completed. Starting up chapter 671, Gerard ponders who this new arrival is, and when Hitsugaya reconfirms it's him, Gerard acknowledges that Hitsugaya was already using Bankai, so this transformation must be something more. Despite his questions, an elated Gerard claims that it doesn't matter how Hitsugaya transformed, all that matters is he's now a more worthy opponent than he was before. In a new moment, Gerard attempts to stab Hitsugaya before mocking him for running despite being transformed. Back to the manga, he then takes his shield and launches it at the captain, but Hitsugaya simply freezes both the shield and the air current behind it with an outstretched hand. Gerard brings his blade down upon Hitsugaya next, but Hitsugaya freezes it and carves it in two with a single swing, seemingly dooming himself. However, the captain reveals that when something is frozen, its functions cease to work, and thus Hoffnung's special ability to carve despair onto those that damage the hope of the people is removed entirely. This is obviously one of the most broken abilities basically in the entirety of Bleach. I'd like to make a separate video on it, to be honest. But yeah, as far as I can tell, this pretty much means that Hitsugaya, in his adult completed Bankai, has the ability to negate and quash basically every single tangible ability in Bleach. Now, is this something that all ice in Bleach can accomplish, or is this just something that's exclusive to Hitsugaya's completed Daiguren Hyorinmaru? For now, we don't really know. But without his sword, Gerard conjures a massive crimson quincy bow with which to blast Hitsugaya, but the captain instantly flash freezes him, using an ability called Shikai Hyoketsu. Interestingly, when Gerard breaks free of the ice here in the anime, we can see that he has fingernails when he grabs Hitsugaya. But in the manga, this form of Gerard's doesn't have any fingernails at all, which was always a bit of a talking point around this idea that he maybe isn't a true human, but is in fact some kind of homunculus or something like that instead. However, as Gerard tries to crush Hitsugaya in his hand, he suddenly collapses to the ground. Looking back, he sees Kenpachi, now reverted to his normal self and missing an arm, jamming his fingers into Gerard's toe, toppling the giant Goliath style. With Gerard now distracted by Kenpachi's surprise intervention, Hitsugaya covers the giant in ice, the freeze creeping across Gerard's face as the Quincy roars that he will never be bound by the elements of this world. And yet it is too late. For Gerard is suddenly horrified as he watches rows and rows of glistening purple swords appear in rings around his head, encircling him on all sides. Behind him, landing on presumably an ice path created by Hitsugaya, Byakuya appears, raising his hand to unleash his definitive final strike, Senkei Senbonzakura Kageyoshi Ultimate Technique, Ika Senjika. Where Byakuya once told Ichigo that the entire procession of swords conjured via Senkei would not all attack him at once, here Byakuya demonstrates the growth of his powers as every single blade turns inward, aiming themselves directly at Gerard's head. And as we reach the cliffhanger of chapter 671, millions upon millions of swords drive themselves into Gerard, the sternritter completely engulfed, vanishing, in a gargantuan purple explosion. As the petals scatter on the wind, Gerard's body crumbles to an icy dust, his entire form collapsing, leaving nothing but the lower halves of his legs left standing upright. And yet, as Byakuya helps steady an exhausted Hitsugaya, the two of them are swallowed up by a brilliant gold light which erupts from the ground behind the captains like a heavenly tempest. Unable to believe their eyes, Byakuya and Hitsugaya look on as Gerard returns to life once again. Only this time his entire body now has to be reformed, and so he becomes a towering monster made only of an ethereal gold light, many of his human features now totally lost. His helmet has transformed even further, becoming a full face helmet complete with reishi plumage, and two large spikes now protrude from his back. Again, I will say, it's really strange to have all of this play out exactly as it does in the manga, and yet not reference the Soul King's heart here, when there is nothing left of Gerard's body whatsoever, when you made a bigger deal out of the heart earlier. But again, I have a feeling that maybe we haven't seen the last of this battle. Well, we see this battle later in the manga too, but only briefly, and it ended in a disappointing fashion. I'm hoping that might not be the case here in the anime, but it could go either way at this point, to be totally honest. But the anime continues to streamline the events of the Varvelt arc in a way that it feels like maybe makes a bit more sense as we skip ahead a few chapters to enable us to then stick with this fight as a healed Rukia and Renji return. It's a bit jarring to have them go from unconscious to mostly completely recovered in the space of like 2 in-universe minutes, but it doesn't really matter. Rukia and Renji mistake Hitsugaya for his fictional older brother, and you just know this joke would have been cut if this took place during Cours 1 or 2. But as Byakuya sends them on their way, demonstrating that the captains don't need their help in a callback to his discussion with Ichigo prior to sending Ichigo to the fake Karakura town, this again is a really nice moment, because this is really where you can start to feel the story coming to its end, in my opinion anyway. The reason I say that is because Byakuya sends them to be with Ichigo because he doesn't know if everyone is going to make it through. You know, as far as they're all concerned, the world could be literally minutes away from ending at this point. And if it's going to end, if they're going to lose, then those two should be with Ichigo. A sentiment echoed by Hitsugaya, who notes that while the GOTEI 13 are Ichigo's comrades, Rukia and Renji are his friends. And the lessons of the Shino Academy basically teach the GOTEI 13 officers that your friends are the people worth fighting for. But as Gerard turns to face the two of them, the episode comes to an end. Well, okay, not quite, because once again, we've got a fair bit left over after the credits roll. Before we get there, Rukia takes center stage in the credits this week, which does feel a bit random. If anything, I wonder if this is maybe meant to be teasing characters who will have a role to play in the final battle against Yhwach in the throne room. But then if that were the case, why would Kisuke be here? Because I don't think he's going to, unless the anime throws us a real curveball. For now, we'll just have to wait and see. But we return to the R&D department, who are still freaking out over the end of the world, which is probably fair enough. Enormous hollows are now marching through the world of the living, having presumably crossed over from Waco Mundo. Now the worlds are truly beginning to merge. And that's kind of cool, because that imagery, huge swaths of ginormous hollows mingling freely with vulnerable humans, well, that kind of sounds a little bit like the primordial world as described in Can't Fear Your Own World. In a great reference, Akon, exasperated, states they've got their hands full already with a bird monster right now. And of course he's referring to Lige. This is all new stuff, totally new. So it gets me thinking that maybe we might see the end of Lige's fight after all this time around. Whether that's by Izuru's hand or someone else's, I wouldn't be surprised to get some closure here. And again, that was kind of teased anyway by Lige appearing in the new opening. It would be cool if one of the birds attacked the R&D Bureau, and maybe someone like Akon had the chance to fight, but I kind of doubt it. However, Yuki Ryunosuke steps up and declares that as the representatives of Karakura Town, he and Shino will do whatever they can to protect the people there. This is again a nice moment for these characters, especially since they were kind of left by the wayside in the manga, when it felt like Kubo wanted to do more with them early on, but maybe couldn't find a place for them, especially Yuki. But what's more important here is that this seems to be setting up a final battle in Karakura Town as well. The war is going to span multiple fronts in the end after all, as the Shinigami try to repel the Hollows in the world of the living and presumably either kill them or send them back to Waco Mundo. If this happens, it is a fantastic and much needed addition in my opinion. The world of the living plays an enormous role in Bleach, yet I guess for fairly obvious reasons it doesn't really have a part to play in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. It's kind of left out of the final arc entirely. At the very least, involving it here will likely allow characters like Tessai to join the fight, and that's not all, because Yuki and Shino are surprised to see a group of other Shinigami arriving at the lab. Leading the charge is none other than the 1st Division Vice Captain Genshiro Okikiba, followed by Kurumadani Zenosuke and Maki, along with other officers. Okay, it's maybe not the most dynamic and encouraging squad I've ever seen, but again, we are bringing literally everyone together for one final battle, and that's awesome. And of course, as the last of the old generation of leaders of Squad 1, Okikiba striking the ground with his Zanpakuto is of course meant to be incredibly reminiscent of Yamamoto, who would do the same with his cane. With the leftover Shinigami resolving to protect the humans then, we move on to the final scene of the episode. And surprisingly, we return to Ichigo and Orihime vs Yhwach, and chapters 675 and 676, as Ichigo releases his Horn of Salvation transformation. Orihime looks on as Ichigo's new form is revealed, and upon seeing the jagged horn now jutting out of his head, she's immediately terrified, recalling the events of the dome so many years before. Yet, as number 1 kicks in the background, which feels very fitting, this is a triumphant moment after all, Ichigo turns to her and immediately puts her fears to rest, revealing that he is still himself after all. Now, interestingly, the hollow eye of this form is actually red, which I don't think anyone expected at all. I've also seen people wondering if the Hellverse movie is now canon, simply because they showed a shot of Ichigo's full hollow form from that movie here. But no, I don't think so. I'm fairly sure they just used it because it's a good forward-facing shot of that form. But as Yhwach muses that Ichigo now looks like a hollow and wonders if that's his hollow mixed with his power, Ichigo briefly explains that it is. But since Ichigo's hollow is a part of his power, a true part of his power, as Ichigo has now of course come to accept, he should be able to theoretically call him out at will. But he's not good at it yet, however, so he simply used Yhwach's power as a catalyst to do so. Interestingly, the anime actually cuts Ichigo's more in-depth explanation regarding the equilibrium between his two sources of power, and I can't help but think we might revisit this scene at the start of next week's episode. But as Ichigo steps past Orihime's shield in an instant, with her unable to notice that he'd gone, he releases his Reiatsu, and it explodes in a multitude of colours, looking completely amazing, totally destroying the roof of Silburn and exposing them to the pitch-black sky outside. As Yhwach compliments Ichigo's new power, the Quincy King goes to draw his Reishi broadsword to meet him on the battlefield, but as he does, Ichigo is immediately upon him, clamping down on Yhwach's hand, forcing his sword back, before bringing his own white blade downwards in a mighty arc, unleashing a streak of gold energy that results in a huge explosion. Despite this, Yhwach just catches Ichigo's sword, which always felt kind of insane to me, and I'll get to that in a second, before he then sends Ichigo flying into the air with a strike from his own weapon. But yeah, this moment has always been kind of weird to me. There is such a huge build-up to this form of Ichigo's, and yet Yhwach just catches the blade immediately. He even goes from saying, "such magnificent power," to, "so weak, did you really think you could kill me with this?" in the space of about 2 seconds. But of course, there is a little more to it than that. For as Ichigo spirals backwards, a gold light explodes into life on the tip of his Zanpakuto. Yhwach mocks Ichigo for choosing to use Getsuga Tensho yet again, but that mocking turns to shock, however, as he notices that Ichigo is doing something rather different. And yes, as Ichigo combines his Getsuga Tensho with a new power, spiraling into life upon the end of his horn, mixed with his blood from the previous attack. Yes, Ichigo fuses his Getsuga Tensho with a Gran Cero, and his eyes turning a blinding demonic red, the vague markings of a hollow mask manifesting upon his face, he launches a crescent moon-shaped blast at Yhwach, the multicolored arc of energy slamming into the Quincy King and seemingly carving straight into his chest. Now, the manga version of this sequence is quite straightforward. Ichigo is seen conjuring a Getsuga, only to then fuse it with a Gran Cero, where it exhibits its trademark almost lightning bolt-shaped spokes while it's charging. Here in the anime, however, it feels like we are supposed to be seeing every element of Ichigo's power flowing into this thing, including bolts of blue, potentially Quincy light. Either way, this frankly, unbelievably good-looking sequence, again, this is movie-quality animation, ends the episode with a bang, setting up a very exciting follow-up to come with episode 5 later this week. Now, the poem this week is a fascinating one, depicting the two fire lilies from the greenhouse, clearly representing Ichigo and Orihime. We hear Ichigo say, "There's nothing I can do, I just want power." After which Orihime says, "The power to protect, that is all I want." I believe this is the first time we have ever had a poem dedicated to two characters, and then when it's followed up by an extremely interesting episode title, well, I certainly have some questions and some expectations as to what the next episode might look like. There's no sternritter in memoriam this week, despite the fact that Gerard was killed twice. He's not gone for good just yet, so let's move right on to the predictions. The next episode, episode 45, is titled Defend You, which isn't a chapter title from the manga. Now, we've had anime-exclusive titles before, but this one feels extra special. As I noted before, we don't really have anything left to cover aside from a few scenes of Uryu vs. Hashwolf. Everything from the manga is now accounted for, which means we only have roughly 10 chapters of manga left for 6 episodes of anime. Considering the anime has been covering approximately, let's say, 4 to 6 chapters an episode so far, well, suffice it to say, there's easily space here for 50% of every single episode upcoming to be totally new, and even in some cases, maybe 1 or 2 episodes that are themselves totally new. And I kind of think that might be the case with the next episode. You see, they blitzed through chapter 676 at the end of this episode in about 2 minutes this week. And the funny thing about that is that that is really all the Horn of Salvation manages to accomplish in the manga. For once Yhwach recovers from the Cero, which happens in about the first 2 pages of the next chapter, it is game over for this form, and that kind of sucks. So I would not be surprised if at least half of this upcoming episode is dedicated to a totally new fight scene featuring both Ichigo and Orihime duking it out with Yhwach, giving Ichigo's new form a real chance to shine before it's kind of done away with, it's swept under the rug, and his Bankai is brought out instead. Perhaps this episode is when Rukia arrives as well. But I have a hard time imagining this episode will feature Ichigo and Orihime versus Yhwach for its entire runtime, 20 minutes or so. That's an awful lot of completely new content. Even Renji versus Uryu or Rukitake's flashback, they were maybe some of the biggest single chunks of new content so far, and even they only maxed out at about 10 to 12 minutes. So this might also be when Uryu vs. Hashwolf transitions to its manga version. If the episode ends with Ichigo activating Bankai, which happens at the end of chapter 677, then the episode will have only covered a single chapter of the manga, and I could see something like that happening at this stage in the game. But for now, that's it from me. That's the end of this week's episode review, the review of episode 44, The Perfect Crimson. That was a big one. That was a long review. There was a lot to talk about, and I appreciate everyone who has stuck with it through to the end. I really do appreciate your support. It means absolutely everything. But let me know what you thought of this episode, the first of the totally new episodes, the ones that we didn't see in the cinema. I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you feel about Kenpachi's Bankai? How do you feel about Hitsugaya's completed Bankai? How do you feel about Gerard's Volstendish? How do you feel about Ichigo's Gran Cero Getsuga fusion? It's been a crazy one. And I have a feeling it's only going to continue like this for the rest of the series now. So we've got a lot to look forward to. But before my voice disappears entirely, I'm just going to sign off now. Thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe down below if you haven't done already. Check out the Patreon as well, where your support goes a massive, massive way. These are long videos to make. They take a lot of work. And again, I really do appreciate everyone's support in helping to keep this channel going. It does mean absolutely everything, and it does help to keep the lights on as well. So thank you all so very much out there. Your support is greatly appreciated. But all right, guys, until next time, thank you so very much for watching. I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.